Welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Naavik's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.naavik.co. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Naavik Roundtable. I am your host for today, Devin Becker. I actually am a Naavik writer and consultant. And then you may see some familiar faces here joining me. I've got Aaron Bush, co-founder of Naavik, who you may have heard many, many times on many of the podcasts here. David Kaye joining us as well, president of Snapshot Games and an angel investor. And then Maria Gillies, our usual host, switching over to a guest role here as senior project or product manager at Hutch.
Hello, everybody.
My heart.
Maria,
Hello.
how does it feel to be on the other side of the glass here?
This is great. I've never had an intro. It's been about almost a year since I've had an intro. So this is quite nice. I like this cozy feeling.
Awesome.
Well, to give you a bit of context, I might be moving on from being a host because I need to get some personal time back, but hopefully staying on and doing some of these as a participant. That was a good answer. I'm too opinionated to be a host. I think that's what we're going with.
Yeah, now you get to expound a bit more on things.
Yeah, so lots of chaos today. New host as panelists. Then, of course, David, this is your second time on, but excited to see where this episode goes. I know we have a lot of fun stuff to talk about.
Yeah, we definitely have quite a few updates as well as some deep dive discussions. We've got some stuff on some Xbox updates, including their cloud gaming stuff, some Stadia Cloud news around their discontinuing their services, COD Mobile possibly sunsetting, and some stuff around a topic you've probably already heard quite a bit about, SVB or Silicon Valley Bank collapsing, some stuff about Applovin. So if you want to get us crack off here, Aaron, on Xbox.
Sure. So I have two short Xbox updates. The first, nice and short, Starfield was delayed again. And this time from the first half of 2023 to now September 6th, I believe. Now I'm sure the game, which is going to be massive and very complex, is being delayed for good quality driven reasons. They don't want to have a Cyberpunk 2077 moment on their hands. So I'm not going to overthink that, but I mention it just because it's a continuation of the pattern of Xbox lacking and delaying exclusive AAA games that is causing Xbox to continue losing market share in this console generation. And that's something we've talked about many times in the past, so we don't need to beat a dead horse here. But hopefully we're nearing a turning point for Xbox's AAA game output, but getting like these big projects right and making sure that Starfield is a hit and, you know, as a driver to bring people to Game Pass and to keep people there, at least for a while. That's going to be important for them to figure out. And of course, the biggest change that would affect Xbox's AAA gaming output is the acquisition of Activision Blizzard, which is still in the hands of regulators, which brings me to part two of this update, which is that in response to European regulators being fixated on cloud gaming as a source of monopolistic concern, which, as we talked about, maybe it was a week or two ago, is a bit silly because it's not actually that important of like a component of the games industry right now, and probably won't be as a standalone entity in its current form, at least for a very long time. But either ways, that's how regulators see it. And in response to that, Xbox just announced two new, you could call them absolutely game-changing deals that no one saw coming, which is that they're striking 10-year agreements to bring Xbox PC games to both Boosteroid and Ubisoft, two cloud gaming companies. I'm sure we all know a bunch about, and we all have heard of.
Finally, I can play.
I was very excited to hear. I've been waiting for an announcement about when are they going to bring Game Pass to Boosteroid. That's really been very top of mind for me, and I'm sure it was also, you know, a very high priority project for the Xbox business development team. So I'm really glad that we finally have seen Game Pass come to Boosteroid.
That's probably the thing that's going to get them over the hump for sure.
Yeah, it's true innovation. Although, David, I did make you out to be more of an Ubisoft kind of guy, so I'm a bit surprised.
Look, I go back and forth. Originally, I was much more of an Ubisoft guy, but I think if you just anyone who's been paying attention really knows that it's really all about Boosteroid these days, and so I'm a real Boosteroid stan now.
I really need a sarcasm alert.
But anyways, in case the sarcasm was not clear enough, this is really just a regulatory dance that Xbox is playing and just saying, hey, we have these games, but we support all of these different platforms and services out there. Like, we're not trying to
look how anti-competitive. Look how anti-competitive we can be.
Yes, we heart competition. Could be the t-shirts that the Xbox execs can wear at the next hearing. So anyways, those are the couple quick Xbox announcements. None of them are too huge of a deal, but it's just interesting to see both the ongoing struggle of AAA games and just the dance they continue to have on the regulatory fronts. And again, that saga will probably come to an end relatively soon. So hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll be able to stop talking about things from like a speculative angle and actually talk about things from a, hey, this is what's actually going to happen angle. So fingers crossed we'll get resolutions there soon enough.
And David, you had some stuff on Stadia that seems kind of relevant given the cloud gaming here.
Well, I think just a quick note. Google announced last week, they announced recently anyway, the shutdown of. So if you recall, when Google shut down the consumer version of Stadia, the actual consumer service, they announced a pivot to a B2B strategy under the moniker, I think it was Immersive Stream. And I was not shocked to hear that has also been shut down now for a couple of reasons. One, it was quite hard to see who this was for and what strategic role it would play for developers and publishers. And I think this was probably also not helped by the fact that their go-to-market for Immersive Stream, as far as I could tell, was let me back up. They had a bunch of publishing agreements, essentially, where they had essentially paid a bunch of developers to bring their content to Stadia. And I think what was interesting was after they announced the shutdown, they terminated all those agreements, including leaving some payments to developers outstanding. And this was the exact same base of people that they went to try and convince them that they should become customers of Immersive Stream, which doesn't seem like didn't really make a ton of sense to me. So I was not shocked to see this outcome.
Well, as a former Stadia fan myself, I'm sad to see it go, but it makes sense that at this point, it's just done for.
But Devin, are you also a Destiny fan?
That was actually the only way I'd play Destiny 2. So it was actually, It's one of those things where it's like, now I'm left in the lurch on quite a few games. Like, I got my refund, right? Like, they were good on the word on, at least to customers on the refunds. It sounds like maybe studios were a little bit on the bad side of that. But at the same time, like, I now have to consider rebuying these games, right? And so it's, as a big cloud person myself, now I'm forced to wait for Starfield, I guess, on Xbox. And I guess also Diablo 4 will not be part of that cloud stuff on launch. So it's going to be it's an interesting year.
It's not being part of the Game Pass, I believe it was announced.
Well, speaking of Microsoft and shutting things down, I got some potential news around Call of Duty Mobile.
Yeah, I hope to bring good news. Maybe it is good news. We'll see. So we spoke about the new Call of Duty mobile game, Warzone, when we were talking about Apex Legends mobile being shut down. And they announced that it's going to be a cross-platform experience. And I think that makes a lot of sense. They're realigning the franchise with the modern expectations of players of being able to play wherever they want, however they want. And I was looking more into what's going to be cross-platform as things like shared progression, which includes the battle pass. That sounds pretty cool. But also your weapons and your cosmetics, a common friends list, cross-platform matchmaking. So it's really tying the game into the centralized franchise. And then when Activision Blizzard reconfirmed Warzone Mobile's 2023 release late last year, they detailed that it was not going to impact Call of Duty Mobile, that was developed and is owned by Timmy Studios, which is a subsidiary of Tencent. But in a response to the UK CMA regarding Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, they revealed that actually Call of Duty Mobile was expected to be phased out over time. And that came a bit of a surprise to players because it was different to what Activision had informed them. And of course, players were very disappointed. I looked at the number of the active player base. And again, take this number with just a bit of a grain of salt. And that's about 24 million players. And a day or so after Microsoft shared that information that was disclosed to the CMA, Activision came out and said, oh, wait, no, we promise that we're actually going to keep committed to Call of Duty Mobile and keep giving you content and updates, which is essentially counter to what Microsoft had said. And so it seems like Activision is still able to call the publisher shots for the game. But I do wonder if the acquisition goes through, do you think that Microsoft might force Activision Blizzard to change its stance? I'm curious what you think.
I mean, this also reminds me of the rift between Blizzard and other Chinese developers, right? Like, could this be like another situation like that?
Maybe. I mean, my take is that it never really made sense for two of these games to be out there and competing for users and competing for monetization, especially when they have such similar modes. And they would be the focus really would be on the same type of player, and just that type of cannibalization doesn't make sense long term. And what I read, at least for what Microsoft was saying, is that Call of Duty Mobile would, I guess, gradually wind down. I don't know exactly what that would look like around the world, except for in China. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know when Activision comes back and says, hey, we'll continue to support it. I don't even know if they're talking like broadly or just for a certain period of time, or if they're just saying words and then it'll really just be in China, but they're not lying. Like, I don't know what the corporate dance really looks like here. But one data point I'll just throw out that, maybe you could have a couple interpretations for it, is that I think it was in October, according to data.ai, paid downloads for Call of Duty Mobile went to zero. They just stopped doing more paid downloads. So you could say that's a result of the UA environment being tough. And maybe it is, but you could also say that maybe they knew they made a decision on how they would think about the future of the franchise. And if they're going to emphasize Warzone more in the future, does it make sense to be spending millions of dollars on UA for a game that's not even going to be their like flagship, at least how they see it anymore? I don't know the answer to that other than to say I just don't see how having both of these out there and competing with each other makes a lot of sense.
I agree, especially when it benefits Activision Blizzard to bring the mobile franchise into its centralized cross-platform because it's stickier, you're in the environment. But at the same time, yeah, they did say that they're going to keep updating it. So I'm curious to see what happens there. And on that data point as well, I went to look at the pre-registration for Warzone, and that passed the 25 million mark and is now on its way to 35 million. They had to add a new goal to give even more stuff to players that pre-register. So that's now crossed the active player base, well, estimated numbers for Call of Duty Mobile. Yeah, I think overall, I'm interested to also understand if this is just more of that strategic move that you mentioned, Devin, about divesting from third-party studios and also centralizing everything Call of Duty under Activision Blizzard.
Yeah, I actually have a bigger picture question that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, or maybe David, you would even have thoughts on this as kind of as an entrepreneur. It seems like there's like a pendulum that's been swinging with. Like over the past few years, it's been like Western companies admitting in certain types of mobile genres that they don't have the expertise. And so they look to get co-development partners with these like Chinese companies that have proven experience. But as we've seen with EA and now Activision, through whatever reason, relationships being tense, the revenue shares not big, ideal, whatever it is. It seems like at least with those two companies, the pendulum is swinging back the other way, where they're saying, "Hey, let's take on the risk and uncertainty, develop internally, reap all the profits, not deal with co-development partnerships the same way." Is that a trend that we're going to see across the industry, or is it really just these two companies standing alone?
I mean, I can share just sort of anecdotally, just things I've heard from developers who've been in these situations. I am. This is not something I've never done. Code. We had Tencent as an investor in our last company, but we didn't. There was no co-development relationship there. I've not heard great things about the reality of co-development between Western and Chinese companies, and I think it comes down to significant cultural differences, unsurprisingly. Also logistically, it's very hard to coordinate across time zones on development. You can, I think, especially when the stakes are as high and the budgets are involved are as large, that just heightens the risks and the challenges. And I think we could see a bit of a pendulum swing back the other way for these reasons.
I see two more reasons. I believe that when a lot of these partnerships started developing, it was at a time where there wasn't a lot of AAA mobile developers and studios that could execute on these kind of games, whilst China's always been ahead in terms of mobile game development. But now I believe that through those co-dev opportunities and developing these higher quality games, the West now has that talent to deliver it on its own. I think additionally, there's just a change in the competitive market where we see now these Eastern companies trying to also take market share from the West. And I don't know if they want to centralize their operations and not have co-dev with a direct competitor that's trying to also take their market share.
Begs the question of whether or not the quality is going to be the same, though, right? Like, obviously Call of Duty Mobile did pretty well on the quality of it, and the development, was obviously up there. But can they replicate that? When they go to do their own, will the game feel totally different and people be disappointed because they'll be like, this doesn't feel like Call of Duty Mobile? Because game feel is pretty big for Call of Duty games.
It's currently soft launched in Australia, and there was also some leaks. And I think what players are saying is that it's the best. It's the best thing that Call of Duty could have done. It's a great experience. The map that they prioritized, it's fun. And the cross-platform, it just makes it streamlined that you have one battle pass, you can carry everything over. But because it's on the same engine as Modern Warfare 2 and the new Warzone, it's meant to be great.
I guess we'll see if they push everyone over. We start seeing ads within Call of Duty Mobile pushing everyone over to Warzone and purposely cannibalizing people over to try and sunset it or not. I guess that'll kind of give us an early indicator there, probably.
I wonder if the T's and C's with the partnership with Timmy Studios would allow that. I'm not sure.
Be interesting to see. Well, we've got some interesting deep dives here today, with especially something that's been on everyone's mind over the weekend and into this week, and possibly even today. A lot of stuff going on, which is SVB, or Silicon Valley Bank's big collapse, along with other banks like Signature that went down over the weekend, but especially focused on what happened here with Silicon Valley Bank.
Yeah, okay, so a lot to cover. You've heard the expression, may you live in interesting times. People have said it's a Chinese curse. It actually was an American politician who made it up, is I actually think where it came from. But anyway, the reason I mention is I'm really happy to say that this topic's about 40% less interesting than when we first picked it for the podcast. And I'm really happy about that, because the most interesting version of events would have been absolutely catastrophic. So it would have been a better podcast, but I'd be having a much worse week. I should also declare, some interest in the. I did have an account and some assets at SVB, and also have quite a number of friends, other entrepreneurs who were affected. So this is the perspective from which I am coming at this discussion. Okay, so some quick background. I'll give an overview, and then we'll sort of dig into some of the more games industry specific aspects of this. So Silicon Valley Bank was a 40-year-old bank set up in 1983. It was the 16th largest bank in the country before its collapse. And it offered a range of services to companies, including obviously checking and deposit services, but they had a number of other areas of business, wealth management, a bunch of different investment products, and also a very active debt business offering loans of various kinds, capital call lines of credits to VCs, as well as venture debt and things like this. And its customer base, obviously, very, very heavy presence in both venture capitalists as well as Bay Area, and not just Bay Area, actually global tech companies, but also served a number of businesses in the Bay Area as well. They were also very, very present in for a lot of climate companies. They were very large in the wine business, and there were many local Bay Area businesses that banked with SVB as well as their local bank. So that's the kind of background on what Silicon Valley Bank actually was. I think what happened over the last couple of years, as we experienced the COVID boom times in technology, there was a huge increase in the bank's deposits. So I believe that between the end of 2019 and the first quarter of 2022, the bank tripled its deposit balances to about 190 something billion dollars. So really, really huge influx of cash that was obviously an outcome of all the money that was flowing in. Companies were raising money, big VC funds were raising big amounts of money, and they were putting it with SVB. What that meant was they ended up with a very with a deposit base that was very heavily skewed towards a relatively smaller number, if you compared them with an average bank, a relatively small number of very, very large accounts. And, that's relevant because the limit, the FDIC deposit limit on what is insured by the federal government is just $250,000, which is a decent amount of money if you're talking about a personal checking account. But as soon as you're talking about businesses that have 30, 50, 100, 1,000 employees, it of course is not. It's less than you need to meet a single payroll cycle. So so far so okay. I think where things really started to go wrong was what they did with this money. And if obviously we remember this was a very low interest rate environment at the time, and so and really the bank's business models are take money and earn more in yield than you're paying out to depositors and keep the difference. There's also lots of other ways they make money, but that's certainly one part of the business model. And so I think where things started to come undone was a pretty significant chunk of these deposits were put into very long dated securities. So these were long dated treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, and of course, what happened in the last 6 months or whatever it's been of this federal, this rate hiking cycle that was, among the most rapid interest rate increases I think that has ever been done in the U.S. economy, more or less. What happened was the value of these bonds was plummeting. And this was a problem for SVB, and they were really kind of actually doubly exposed to the increase in interest rates. Partly because, as I said, they had invested in all these long-dated bonds that were no longer very attractive compared to the interest rates that people could get today. But then they also had a depositor base that was very exposed to interest rate increases as well, right? So, tech companies, everyone always talks about sort of tech companies being more of a zero interest rate phenomenon. People's appetite for risk goes up when assets are, when interest rates are low. And so their depositor base really needed to actually start drawing down on their on the money that they had. And so what that meant was Silicon Valley Bank was essentially being forced to sell these securities at a loss at a time when the value was plummeting. And what kicked all of this off was as a result of this, they announced they were going to do a capital raise, which never got completed. They announced the capital raise on the same day that Silvergate Bank collapsed, which also not ideal from a communications perspective, probably. And basically this kicked off a bank run, which was, I think, and this is one of the things that I think was a bit specific to SVB and also specific to maybe what bank runs look like in 2023, which is this happened at an unprecedented speed. So, they had about $40 billion in outflows in one day. It was Thursday, I believe it was. And I think this was a combination of, one, they had a customer base that was very, very highly concentrated in a couple of sectors, and also these are terminally, like all of us, terminally online people who would talk to each other all the time, and so the speed that this happened was just unprecedented. Anyway, that's the recap. That's what happened. I think what's interesting and what's sort of relevant, why do we care about this as a podcast talking about games? I think there's a couple of reasons. So first of all, as I said at the outset, there were quite a number of particularly venture-backed game companies that were keeping their funds with SVB, and also a number of the VCs that game companies that raised money from also had their money there. And particularly as we approach GDC, where a lot of pitching is going to be going on, it's worth asking what impact is this going to have on the landscape. But first, I want to just talk about the reaction to the bailout. So I should say the final kind of the sort of happy ending to the story is the federal government stepped in here and announced that they were essentially going to guarantee the deposits of the people who had money with SVB. I think it's really important to draw a distinction between what happened here and what happened in the to some of the GSIBs, the systemically the big banks during the financial crisis. This was not a bailout of the bank's shareholders or bondholders. In fact, I think the banks basically the equity is going to be zeroed. This was them stepping in to say, hey, if you had money at SVB, even if it was much, much more than the $250 limit, we are going to make sure you have access to that money. And the reaction to this, to me, was maybe not surprising, but it was really disheartening. And this is a reaction I saw both from the various corners of the media, but also actually from a number of games industry, non-SVB games industry CEOs. And the reaction was basically, this is a bailout of rich VCs, and they shouldn't be helped. And like this, again, like I have a dog in this race. And there were CEOs, there were game company CEOs who I knew were having a pretty terrible weekend trying to figure out how the hell they were going to meet payroll. And I think I'm going to declare my perspective and then maybe ask for maybe some alternative perspectives from you guys. But here's my take. If you're a game company CEO, you raise $5 million from a VC, and a VC says, hey, you should use this bank because they understand your business. They're going to be able to. And I speaking as someone who has banked with various places, and including large banks that have no understanding of what you do, and trying to do things like get any kind of a loan for anything, and just being told no. There were a lot of reasons why people had money with this institution. And my belief is, if you put a bunch of money with your bank, it is a reasonable expectation as a game company CEO to say, you know what, I don't have to think too. I should not have to go and look at the bank's balance sheet and analyze its duration exposure or interest rate risk or any of the other things that it's hard enough to focus on just building a company, building a startup, analyzing the market, building a team, making games. And I think that this idea that you were somehow irresponsible for putting your money with a 40-year-old bank and expecting it to be there on Monday, I have no sympathy for the perspective that this was somehow irresponsible. You should have spread your money across 40 different banks. But I don't know. Maybe there are definitely other perspectives. So I'll shut up for a second and would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it is a wake-up call if you are a CEO and you have a fiscal responsibility to a business to recognize that, hey, maybe I should be paying a bit more attention here because reality isn't exactly as it seems. I actually agree with you on basically everything you said about how a lot of the reaction was disheartening. Like, I do think there probably are some fair criticisms you could say of like what some VCs are saying on Twitter, or just like how
Yeah.
some people were taking advantage of the situation to try to, spark new pretty egregious terms to like loan out money to help companies throughout the crisis. But in general, yeah, when things like this happen, like most people should handle this with some level of empathy, right? Even if you can't directly help, to at least be understanding of those who are
I
going
think
through the situation.
I mean, you can probably draw some further distinctions here, right? Like, one of the companies that was caught up in this was, apparently Roku had, $500 billion in cash with SVB. And,
Yeah.
You could argue that a publicly traded company that presumably has a very well paid CFO and finance team should be expected to have a more sophisticated approach to treasury management, such that they are managing their risk in a very, very active way. But I sort of, that's a very different thing than, a 30-person, 50-person startup that, let's face it, like, you're not an expert on what this entire landscape. And I sort of wonder actually if maybe one solution is just a higher limit for businesses. Like a $250,000 does not go very far for a, for a business. And maybe that's part of the solution. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it probably should be. I mean, I think that it's I agree it's unrealistic that companies should be able to like have to spend a lot of time reading the balance sheets of their banks to really understand what's going on. Also because a lot of times just bank financials are super opaque. And not to like, get too in the weeds of like bank finances, which I'm sure all of our readers or listeners, love hearing about. But like there are essentially loopholes in the system that like with Silicon Valley Bank, they didn't have to price their loans to the market. And so it made it look like their assets were larger than they actually were if they were being priced at like the current rates. And so, yeah, it's just like,
and
it
again,
takes
like
extreme
as a
diligence.
startup founder, should I be expected to understand the distinction between the held to maturity and available for sale categorization of bank debt? Like, maybe I should. I don't know. I mean, I do think we will see a proliferation of new products that are designed, if I'm already starting to see them, that are designed to help address this risk, in terms of this treasury risk. So, I can definitely see that starting to change. The final thing I maybe want to leave this on is, as far as do we see this having a long-term impact or anything on the fundraising environment? I don't think that there are massive long-term implications here. I do think that as we look at the near-term / medium-term funding environment, like there's a dial. The way I think about the investing landscape is there's an axis. There's the fear greed axis, right? And you're always somewhere along a continuum. And I think there's no question, even though crisis has been averted here, I do think this definitely moves us a couple of notches towards the fear side of the continuum, and that's not a great place to be if you need to raise money right now.
I got a question then. What do all these people do, especially the game studios, do now with that money now that they've taken it out, right? They just can't put it in their mattress.
Yeah.
They probably don't have time to do a whole bunch of due diligence on new banks, but they've got to put it somewhere, right? To pay payroll or whatever. What do they do now at this point?
Yeah.
Well, that was part of the really stressful last week, where you have to go through the checks to open accounts, and that takes 2 days, 3 days, and you're trying to do that towards the end of the week to have somewhere to put your money.
Yeah, what I would say, where I was going to kind of connect the dots to saying like it's unreasonable for company leaders to like fully understand the financials of their bank, but it is more reasonable for them to start to risk manage a bit in terms of not putting all their eggs in one basket. And even with a company like Roku, like it had a lot of money in one bank, but that still was like a percentage of like a smaller percentage of the money it had all around. But even then, I mean, you could kind of be critical of that. But as a leader, like managing the cash of your company, I mean, I think not having all your eggs in one basket is probably a wise move. Now that we realize that the 250K marker is maybe it's low, and the government stepped in this time, but you never know in the future, and you also never know like what that could look like with other governments around the world. The last thing I was just going to say is like there's money that you can have in banks, but even then, I'm starting to see more like alternative kinds of options. So, for example, Mercury is a financial platform. They're not a bank themselves, but they basically create the interface and connect you to banks. And they have what's called a sweep network, which basically is instead of like if you deposit your money through Mercury, it doesn't go into one account. It gets spread out across, I think now they have like 12 partners or something. And so their insured rate is 3 million, 12 times higher than the 250K. So it wouldn't surprise me if we start to see some like more solutions like that get thrown out, and something like that genuinely is probably like really good for startups to consider, where it's the same simple interface, but behind the scenes the complexity is kind of taking care of the insurance management. The other thing I was just going to say for larger companies is not everything needs to be held specifically in cash. Like you can have I mean, look at like the best companies in the world for managing their capital. Like if you look at a Berkshire Hathaway, you'll see that they have a lot of money in short-term treasuries too, which is basically putting your money with the government and getting not awesome rates of return, but just like an alternative to bank accounts, and you can spread it out in different terms, different governments, different ways. And so I don't know if all companies need to be thinking about that, but I do think there are alternatives versus just having all of your money in one spot. And then it's just up to the companies and however much money they have and what they're looking to do with their money to figure out how they want to spread it out across these different things. So it's not perfect, and I expect we'll see some regulatory change, but there still is some action leaders can take to de-risk. But anyways, I did cut you off there, Maria. So I don't know if you want to get back to the point that you were making.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that with SVB UK, the limit is actually 85,000. That's guaranteed pounds, so much lower. And HSBC acquired the UK arm in order to bail the companies that had their money with them. But I think it might also be a cultural thing as trusting a bank with all of your eggs in one basket. In Portugal, we don't trust the government. We come from a position of distrust, and you always want to control your finances because who knows if a bank might collapse. And so one of my jobs when I first started in the fishing industry, I spent a year just managing multiple bank accounts and always making sure that all of that risk was mitigated. And so maybe I think we'll definitely see a change in wanting to protect your money, but it could also have been just from a cultural perspective, not having that as something first and foremost.
It's also a situation where even not having all of your eggs in one basket still could impact. So, for example, like Circle with USDC, it was enough money in there to potentially depeg the whole thing and not have enough to back it and stuff like that. So it's like depending on which money it is over there and what they need it for. Like like the payroll situation was the big one for empathy for these situations because that affects people downstream as well. Whereas it's like, what type of money is over here? Is it appropriate for here? When you spread your stuff out, do you have to have some stuff all in one chunk, for example? Because you're like, say, payroll probably you can't distribute it across 50 banks very well, right? Like, so I imagine this is going to be like a complex situation to resolve, like even with new, better practices of like how to manage this stuff, right?
Yeah, I hope governments come to look at this and try to modernize the system a bit. At least in terms of how company accounts work, and also just how banks themselves manage risk too.
Exactly.
There's probably some work to be done there. We don't need to dig into the weeds of that, but yeah, for the sake of everyone, I think there's some work to be done on the system.
Well, speaking of divesting eggs different places, we got an interesting one here from Applovin spinning off redemption games and them fundraising.
Yeah, what a transition there.
That was really good.
Yeah, that was good. So last week it was announced that Applovin spun out Redemption Games, and the spinoff on Redemption side was also paired with a venture raise of $7 million. And I want to cover this briefly from both the Redemption and Applovin sides. But let's start with Redemption since I think it's simpler. And for some brief background, Redemption Games was founded by Michael Witz and Dan Lin in 2019. These guys originally were behind the hit Cookie Jam, but Redemption Games originally set out to build a game called Sweet Escapes, which is a match 3 bakery themed game, which according to VentureBeat has amassed more than $60 million in revenue. And currently, the team is working on 2 new games. One is another puzzle game, but the other is a Web3 digital collectible game of sorts. And I don't know much about either, but I suspect the latter is maybe part of the reason why Redemption sought to leave Applovin, which has been very free-to-play mobile focused, and go independent again. And we can talk about the Applovin side of things next, but really before digging into like the Applovin side of the equation and all that's going on there, David, I do want to hear your insights on the Redemption side. You're an advisor to Redemption Games, and you led Merit Circle's investment in them in this latest round. So I'm curious, just what attracted you to this team and whatever it is they're building, or if you have any color on just the spinoff as a whole.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you've certainly declared my biases for me, so that's great. Look, I think as someone who looked at, talks to a lot of startups and looked at a lot of Web3 deals, this is exactly the kind of team and company that you want to see entering the space, because I think their approach is really interesting. So first of all, you have a team that shipped games before, which is obviously really, really positive. Michael's a great entrepreneur. He's been making games since the days of the Facebook platform back in 2009, 2008, 2009 period, and specifically that team has been shipping games together for a significant amount of time, and I think that is a very, very people don't talk about it as much, but it's there's a lot of focus. There's a sort of become almost like a cliche that in venture, like you have all these, the classic thing to do, which Mitch Lasky called kind of a lazy approach, is you throw a bunch of money at a bunch of ex-Riot people, and hope for the best. And I think that like a much better strategy is if you can find a team that's sort of getting the band back together essentially, and they've got that shorthand, they've worked together, they've shipped together before. That's rare actually, and from my perspective, really, really valuable. I think the other thing that is really good to see is they have they're taking a little bit of a portfolio approach. I'm noticing this with some of the stronger teams who are announcing Web3. They're a bit diversified from a sort of platform perspective. So in the case of Redemption, without going too much into detail about what they're doing, they have one thing that's a little bit more traditional, playing to some of the stuff that they've done before, and then they have a bet that's a little bit more out there. And I think that is, from a venture investor perspective, a very attractive sort of risk. Well, it depends. I guess it depends on your outlook as a venture. Some VCs just want you to go balls to the wall and pursue the riskiest possible thing. And in the case of us, so personally though, I really like the fact that you have a team that's taking a bit of a diversified approach and combining more traditional approaches with more innovative ones. And yeah, I'm a big fan of Michael and that team, and I'm excited about what they're doing.
Awesome.
Do you think there's some parallels then with what happened with Jam City spinning out their Web3 game into Play Labs? Like that sort of idea of like, hey, we're an established mobile game company. We know what we're doing there, but we want to do some more experimental stuff. Maybe we should spin this off.
Yeah, I think it's a little. I think it's a little different. In the case of Jam City, when you've got this sort of scaled, somewhat at least semi-scaled mobile game company, I think it's really I've seen this happen a little bit. I don't know how much has been announced, but I've seen this happen a few times before. It's pretty hard. It makes sense to spin the more the more sort of venture. You think about this. If you're looking at them as investments, one is a very different stage investment than the other. So when you have a larger company, for a whole bunch of reasons, it makes a lot of sense to have something in a separate entity that can be financed separately, be a separate thing, basically.
Yeah, but do you think the Web3 aspect of redemption is part of what led it to leave Applovin too, or
I really can't. I really can't speculate or talk about any of the.
okay, no, that's cool.
In fact, actually, I don't even think that Michael even announced that they had spun out from Applovin. That was, I think, a detail. I mean, look, it's not rocket science if you looked at who owned it before, but I actually don't even think Michael and the team even announced that it was spinning out when they did.
Okay. Interesting. But yeah, the other side of the equation here is just Applovin, which I think is interesting to chat through. Is just like, what are they up to? What are they doing? Like, what is this? What does this move maybe just like hint at, like, bigger picture how they're approaching their mobile games business? And if you recall, a couple of years ago, Applovin was one of the hottest new companies to IPO in the games industry, right? In part because of how the two sides of its business, the app side, which was largely mobile games, and the ad tech software side, how those two complemented each other. And there were some concerns at the time about conflicts of interest around leveraging third-party data for internal games, but the business itself was clicking really well. But then ATT happened, right? As has happened across the industry and affected many companies, and everything changed. And I won't rehash the full history there, but the high level results for this last quarter for Applovin are informative, in my opinion. The ad tech software side of the business is up nicely, while the apps business, revenue wise, is down nearly 30%. And earnings are also held way down, partially because of high stock-based comp, but also it looks like they did some like asset write-offs too. And if you look over the past few quarters, it's easy to get the sense that from management that they are focusing their future much more on the software side. I don't think that's a secret. I think they've been pretty transparent about that is where they are leaning, and that doesn't mean that they are completely winding down the app side. Although maybe if a buyer came to the portfolio, looking to buy everything, I'm sure they'd happily consider it. But what it does mean is that the apps business is getting a lot of scrutiny internally, and that scrutiny has entailed layoffs, studio closures, completely rethinking the UA strategies, of course, restructuring of earnout arrangements, etc. And much of this has happened, but based on the redemption news, it seems pretty obvious that Applovin will continue staying open to winding down certain operations or handing things over or just getting creative in its ways to kind of like hand things off in the apps business elsewhere. And so I'm curious what you all make of Applovin these days, maybe at a high level, and just kind of thinking about like the apps, the mobile game side of their business. Do you suspect that they'll continue to wind that down either in big ways or in small ways? Yeah, I'm just curious where you all maybe see that business flowing there.
I don't think it's a coincidence that two of the most high reputation companies of the industry that are data led in how they try to create new games and iterate on new games are spinning off the studio or shutting down new games like Betika did. And I assume that Applovin might also be suffering in that regard with the ATT changes where, yeah, they were data led in how, like, what markets do we target? What kind of games do we aim to quickly prototype and throw out there? Yep. And so it might make more sense to just follow into their strongest suit, which is the software side.
On Applovin, I mean, if you look at those two businesses have very different characteristics, right? The sort of mediation ad network piece of the business and the studio piece of the business. And it is pretty telling that on the one hand, you have a piece of the business that is highly exposed to the changes in the privacy landscape. And I think if you talk to a lot of founders who are running mobile game studios, they will tell you how broken the UA landscape is right now. So you have a piece of business that's highly exposed to that, and then you have a piece of the business that, if not, I don't think it would be fair to say it benefits from it in any way, but certainly you're not taking that same level of risk. You're taking a margin on activity, and they have a pretty strong position on that side of the business. So it sort of makes sense that they would double down on that and dial down their exposure to the other piece, just based on the characteristics of the two businesses, right?
Yeah, I'm just curious what that looks like. And I mean, I think that'll mean that the scales will continue to tip more towards the software side, obviously. And we also know from a few months ago that when the Unity Iron Source merger was announced, Applovin stepped in to try to, get Unity to say no to Iron Source and join forces with them instead. And so I still think it is telling, like, even if they're trying to like rethink, wind down, optimize the app side of the business, there still is more work to be done on the software side to best position themselves competitively. And obviously the Unity deal didn't go through with them, for better or worse. But yeah, maybe just final question. If anyone has any thoughts on the software ad tech side, what do you make of the that landscape these days? Like, do you think we'll see more consolidation? Are there enough like big players left out there to continue to consolidate into to kind of rally around like these bigger companies that can help developers move the needle more? Or like, what realistically should we expect from an Applovin as they refocus on the ad tech side?
These are businesses that benefit from scale, right? So if you have the ability to be one of the scaled players, then you're in a stronger position than anyone else. So
sure. Yes, I think we're going to see, and we might already be seeing, a change in the landscape where bigger gaming studios that own, multiple subsidiaries, have a portfolio of games, that they'll make more investment in trying to pull their data and have a holistic data source to make learnings that don't have as much limitation in terms of the transparency and the granular detail. But I also think we might see these software solutions become more specialized, potentially, in terms of the genre and what kind of platforms they can target players from. I know that there are already some networks that are ideal for if you're going to do a hyper casual game, or if you're going to be doing a mid-core game, you want to go with more of your percentage of spend on another network. So again, it's not a very informed opinion, but based on what I've been seeing, that could be a direction that is going through. And I think I remember that Applovin was already looking to restructure and separate their games business from their software business. So it could just be that they have that appetite already exists to potentially accept some spin-offs and let some of these studios go if they wish to do so.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting too, just from the standpoint of when you're so reliant on massive platforms to dictate the policies that affect an entire industry, like how you think about your strategy and tactics around that. They can just change at a whim, and they have changed on a whim in the past. Obviously, like Applovin was bringing together these two sides of the business together for a reason that overnight basically made that strategy fall apart and forced them to rethink. There's a chance, 3-5 years from now that once App Store policies continue to change, new best practices are found in UA or new platforms where that happens, that even like what they would come up with, like a game plan for thinking about the future, that completely changes again, just in terms of how ad tech works and merging businesses together like this. So yeah, I can't help just kind of shake the thought in the back of my head that we just don't really know, like, the next 5 years of what makes sense, because it's so dependent on big platforms and whatever they do. But yeah, it's an interesting situation Applovin has been, and how kind of sad how far they've fallen from the hype that they had a couple of years ago.
Cool. Well, I want to thank all the panelists, of course, familiar faces here that I'm sure will be back for joining today. Had some good topics, and I look forward to seeing all the rest of you guys next week.
If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, level up your insights with our premium research platform, Naavik Pro, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.